I stared at my phone, rereading my mother's text for the 10th time. Family dinner tonight. Don't be late like always. 5 short words, but they hit like a punch to the stomach. My chest tightened, and the familiar knot twisted in my gut, part anxiety, part anger. I should have been used to it by now. After all, this was my mother, Yvette Whitfield, the woman who knew exactly how to lace guilt and disappointment into every message. I'm Alexandra. 36 years old. And on paper, I'm what you'd call a success story. I own one of the most profitable real estate development firms in the city. Multi-million-dollar projects, high-rise luxury apartments, you name it, I built it. But if you sat across from my mother at dinner, you'd never know. To her, I'm just Stephen's wife. The woman who does something with apartments while the real adults build proper careers and raise perfect families. My achievements? Invisible. My worth? Always measured against everyone else at that godforsaken dinner table. And the cruelest irony? Every single one of them, my mother, my brother-in-law Michael, his wife Hope, and even Stephen, lived in the crown jewel of my real estate empire. The Whitfield Plaza. Luxury units, skyline views, top-of-the-line amenities. Their rent checks, paid on time every month, went straight into my company's accounts. They just had no idea. Because I kept it that way. By choice. It started with one duplex, bought with the $50,000 inheritance my grandmother left me when I was 25. Everyone said I was foolish, especially my mother. You could have bought a real home, something nice, she'd said with a tight smile. Instead of that rundown shack. But I saw potential. That duplex turned into another property, then another. By my 30s, I was a silent powerhouse in the city's property market. But I learned something along the way: power is best wielded quietly. Especially around people who've spent their whole lives underestimating you. So, I let them believe I was just a part-time property manager, Stephen's wife with a little hobby. It was easier that way. Until that night. That dinner. The night I finally stopped playing small. It started like all the others. My stomach in knots as I smoothed down my black dress in front of my mother's apartment door, my apartment, technically. I heard Stephen's voice behind me, gentle as always. You okay? He asked, his hand on the small of my back. I forced a smile and nodded. He didn't know the full truth either. We had a mutual understanding about finances, we kept them separate. He knew I was doing well, but he didn't know I owned half the neighborhood. It wasn't deceit. Not really. It was protection. But that night, all the lies, by omission or otherwise, started to suffocate me. The moment the door opened, I felt the familiar wave of criticism masquerading as concern. My mother's eyes flicked over me like I was a disappointing purchase she wanted to return. Finally, she said with that tight smile. Everyone's been waiting. Michael and Hope brought wine, real wine from Italy. Maybe you can take notes. The comments didn't stop. They never did. Michael smirked from across the room. Rough day at the little office, Alex? You look tired. Hope chimed in, her voice honeyed with fake sympathy. Oh, don't worry, Alex. We know you're busy with whatever it is you do. Each word was a paper cut. Small, but relentless. And over time, paper cuts can drain you dry. I wanted to scream that I'd just closed a multi-million-dollar deal that morning. That the renovations everyone was complaining about were part of my newest development. That the penthouse they envied belonged to one of my top clients. But I didn't. I swallowed it down, like I always did. Until the moment everything changed. Mom stood at the head of the table, wine glass in hand, wearing the smug expression she saved for big announcements. I've started a petition to replace the building's management, she declared proudly. The service has been terrible. I've already collected signatures. We're going to get someone competent in charge. The blood drained from my face. The terrible service she was referring to? That was my team, overhauling the building's entire electrical system because the previous owner cut corners. That petition? A threat against my business. And the way everyone nodded, laughed, encouraged her, it hit me harder than I expected. Because they didn't just underestimate me. They disrespected me. And in that moment, something snapped. The mask I wore for so long, the quiet, accommodating, don't rock the boat daughter, it slipped. They didn't know it yet, but dinner was about to be served with a side of cold, hard truth. Because I was done hiding. By the end of that night, they would finally understand exactly who I was. And they would regret every single word they'd ever spoken to diminish me. But what I didn't know, what I couldn't know, was that taking my power back would cost me more than I ever imagined. Have you ever felt completely blindsided by someone you trusted? Comment 111 if you know that pain. I don't know exactly when I realized that my relationship with my mother was different. Maybe I was too young to see it for what it was. Or maybe I always knew, deep down, but I wanted so badly to believe I could earn her love if I just worked hard enough. That if I became everything she wanted, she'd finally look at me with the same warmth and pride she gave to others. But with Mom, love was a transaction. And I was always coming up short. Yvette Whitfield had a gift, a rare talent for wrapping cruelty in elegance. She could reduce you to nothing with a smile and a perfectly rehearsed laugh, all while the people around her nodded in agreement. Alexandra, you're so ambitious, darling. If only you had Hope's charm, you could really be something. Or my personal favorite, you work so hard. It's admirable, really. Perhaps one day you'll actually see some success. That was my childhood. That was my normal. I didn't even flinch anymore when she said it. I'd smile, nod, and swallow the ache in my chest, because fighting back never worked. If you pushed against Yvette, she'd cut deeper next time. And God help you if you showed her it hurt. Hope, my sister-in-law, was the golden child. She married my brother Michael, but you'd think she'd been handpicked from the heavens to grace our family. She was everything I wasn't, bubbly, charming, effortlessly social. She knew how to make my mother beam with pride, and I hated how easy it seemed for her. Hope never worked a day in her life, not really. She dabbled in multi-level marketing schemes, selling beauty products and weight loss teas while preaching about female empowerment. She called it entrepreneurship. I called it a pyramid scheme. But to Mom, Hope was a self-made businesswoman. And me? I was just managing a few apartments. Even Stephen, my husband, my safe place, wasn't immune to Mom's influence. She adored him. He was an architect at a prestigious firm, climbing the ranks, the kind of man who made her look good in front of her friends. Stephen is going to make partner any day now, she'd boast at dinner parties. Then she'd turn to me with a patronizing smile and add, and Alexandra is, well, she keeps herself busy. She loved him for what he represented. And I loved him because he was everything my family wasn't, steady, kind, and patient. He didn't care that I worked late nights or that I wasn't baking cupcakes for school fundraisers like Hope. He loved me for me. At least, that's what I believed then. But the truth is, I was hiding. From him, from them, from myself. Because I knew if they saw the real me, the woman who had built an empire from nothing, they wouldn't celebrate me. They'd find a way to diminish it. They'd claim credit or accuse me of thinking I was better than them. I didn't want to give them the chance. When my grandmother passed away, she left me $50,000. It wasn't life-changing money, but it was something. Something that was mine. The others, Mom, Michael, even Hope, they scoffed when I said I was going to invest it in real estate. Mom had wanted me to put a down payment on a bigger house, something to keep up appearances. She told me buying property was reckless. You don't know what you're doing, Alexandra. Real estate is a man's world. You'll get eaten alive. I almost listened to her. Almost. But something in me snapped that day. Maybe it was the way she said it, as though failure was inevitable for me. As though I was incapable of more. So, I bought my first duplex. It was old, run down, and I was terrified. But I learned. I learned how to negotiate contracts, work with contractors, and read the fine print. And slowly, that duplex paid for the next one. And then the next. 10 years later, I owned half the residential blocks in our neighborhood, including the very building my family called home. Whitfield Plaza was my crown jewel, a 30-story testament to every late night, every risk, and every time I bit my tongue at that dinner table. But they didn't know. Not my mother. Not Michael. Not Hope. Not even Stephen. Because it was easier that way. Peace came at the price of invisibility. And I paid it. Every day. The worst part? I let them live in my building, for below market rates. It was Stephen's idea at first. He thought it would keep the family close. I agreed because, back then, I still believed that if I provided for them, if I gave them comfort and stability, they'd see my value. They'd love me for it. They didn't. They complained. Constantly. Hope griped about slow maintenance whenever a light bulb flickered. Michael threw around legal jargon, reminding me, without knowing it, that he knew people who could handle property disputes. Mom treated the building like her personal kingdom. She'd snap at the concierge, demand upgrades to her apartment, and whisper about how the management was slipping. She was talking about me. Insulting me to my face without even realizing it. I should have told them. I should have said, "This is mine. I built this. Every brick, every window, every paycheck, me." But I didn't. Because I was scared. Scared they'd twist it, claim I owed them more, or, worse, belittle it. Turn my empire into another thing they dismissed over dinner. So, I kept quiet. And every month, their rent checks landed in my company's account. Every month, I subsidized their comfort while they mocked my ambition. And yet, I loved them. That's the hardest part to admit. I loved my mother, despite everything. I wanted her approval. I loved Hope, in her own shallow, infuriating way. I even loved Michael, who had once been my protective older brother before he learned to weaponize his success. I loved them so much that I let their opinions shape my self-worth. Every time Mom compared me to Hope, I felt small. Every time Michael dismissed me as playing business, I questioned myself. The money, the buildings, they were my armor. Proof that I was more than what they saw. But armor gets heavy. And the longer you wear it, the harder it is to remember who you are underneath. That night, as I sat at the dinner table, listening to my mother boast about her petition to replace the terrible management, something broke. It wasn't just the insult. It was the realization that all my sacrifices, all the times I let their words wash over me, all the times I paid their rent without question, meant nothing to them. I wasn't their daughter, sister, or in-law. I was a footnote in their lives. A placeholder until someone more impressive entered the room. Years of loyalty, of providing, of hoping they'd see me, for nothing. That night, I decided to stop hoping. The woman they thought they knew? She died at that dinner table. The woman who built Whitfield Plaza, the woman who knew her worth, was ready to stand up. And when she did, they would regret every single word they had ever spoken. Have you ever sacrificed so much for someone, only to feel like it meant nothing? Comment 222 below. That night started like all the others, a suffocating routine wrapped in the guise of family bonding. I stood outside my mother's apartment door, smoothing down my dress, rehearsing the same deep breaths I always took before stepping into that room. My husband Stephen was next to me, his gentle hand on the small of my back, offering his usual quiet reassurance. "You okay?" he asked softly. I nodded, though I wasn't. I never was before these dinners. Inside, the living room buzzed with false cheer. My sister-in-law, Hope, was already mid-sentence, gushing about her latest business milestone. Some vitamin supplement her MLM company had launched. Michael, my brother-in-law, stood with his usual air of superiority, swirling his wine glass like he was presiding over a courtroom. And my mother, Yvette, moved through the room like a queen holding court, every comment laced with judgment, every smile a veiled threat. I greeted them all, as I always did, swallowing the knot in my throat. Dinner was served. I sat in my usual spot, next to Stephen, across from Hope, taking my place in what had become my personal theater of humiliation. It began with the jabs disguised as jokes. Michael asked if I'd finally figured out how rent payments worked, and Hope leaned over to whisper that maybe I should buy dessert next time since cooking isn't really your thing. Stephen tried to deflect when he could, but he was outnumbered. And Mom, oh, Mom, she was the maestro, orchestrating the performance with surgical precision. It was the same every time. Until it wasn't. Midway through the meal, Mom stood. She clinked her wine glass lightly, drawing the room's attention. That familiar smile stretched across her face, but there was an edge to it. A glint in her eyes that made my stomach turn. I have an announcement, she said, her voice dripping with that performative authority she wielded so well. I've started a petition to replace the building management. My fork froze midair. My heart stuttered, then kicked into a furious pace. I felt Stephen glance at me, but I couldn't look away from her. You've all seen how terrible things have gotten, the maintenance delays, the constant renovations. We deserve better. So, I've taken the lead, she continued, her tone swelling with pride. Most of the residents on my floor have already signed. Laughter. Agreement. Michael leaned back smugly. About time someone did something. This place has been going downhill for years. Hope chimed in with a theatrical sigh. Oh, thank God. Maybe now someone will actually fix the gym. Their voices blurred together, but I heard every word like a knife to my chest. Each syllable carved away at my composure. I had ordered those renovations, the electrical overhaul, the plumbing upgrades, because the previous owner had cut dangerous corners. I was protecting them. Investing in their comfort, their safety. And here they were, mocking me, ridiculing me, completely unaware that the very building they lived in was mine. And then Michael turned to me. Alex, he smirked, raising his glass, you work in real estate, right? Maybe you could finally do something useful and help us with this petition. Laughter exploded around the table. Stephen shifted uncomfortably beside me, but he didn't speak. He never did, not when it came to my family. He knew these nights were mine to endure. He had no idea how deep the wounds went. I gripped my fork so tight, my knuckles turned white. This was beyond the usual passive aggression. This was an ambush. They were tearing apart everything I had built, everything I had given them, right to my face. And they didn't even know it. I wanted to scream. I wanted to slam my fist on the table and shout, I built this. Every brick, every wall, you live here because of me. But I didn't. Because years of conditioning had taught me otherwise. Instead, I smiled. A small, tight-lipped smile. The same one I always wore when I was swallowing back the hurt. The same one I'd perfected after every constructive criticism from Mom. The same one I used every time I was made to feel like nothing. But inside, something shifted. This time, the hurt didn't just sting, it burned. This time, the humiliation wasn't just cutting, it was fueling something deeper. This time, I decided, enough. As Mom leaned over to refill Michael's wine glass, she glanced at me and said, You're 36 now, Alexandra. Don't you think it's time you figured out what you're doing with your life? Her voice was light, but the intent was lethal. A blade coated in honey. Fine isn't good enough. That's what she was really saying. You aren't good enough. I felt the heat rise in my chest, rage, grief, exhaustion, swelling together until it was choking me. I set my fork down carefully. Deliberately. I looked around that table, at their smug faces, their laughter at my expense, and I saw it clearly for the first time. I had spent years breaking my back to give them comfort. I had sacrificed weekends, vacations, my mental health, just to make sure their homes were perfect. I had subsidized their lives. And in return, they mocked me, belittled me, treated me like a failure. All for what? The truth hit me like a punch to the gut. I was nothing more than a paycheck to them. A joke they could laugh at over wine. The daughter who never quite measured up. I had mistaken tolerance for love. And that was my breaking point. I glanced at Stephen. He was still smiling politely, but I could see the tension in his jaw. He was uncomfortable, but he wouldn't intervene. He had learned, just like I had, that you didn't challenge my mother. You endured her. Not anymore. I made a decision at that table. I wasn't going to endure them. I wasn't going to shrink to keep the peace. I wasn't going to be invisible. They wanted a battle over the building's management? Fine. But they had no idea they were declaring war on the person who held the deed to their homes. I was done playing small. I was done buying their love with discounts and silence. I had built my empire brick by brick. Now, I was ready to defend it. Let them come with their petitions and their smug remarks. Because when the truth came out, when they realized that the woman they had dismissed for years was the one holding their future in her hands, they would regret every word. I forced my lips into another smile and lifted my wine glass. To family, I said softly. Mom beamed, thinking she had won, again. But I knew something she didn't. This was the last time they would ever look down on me. What would you have done in my shoes? Comment 333 and let me know. I didn't sleep that night. Not really. After we left my mother's apartment, Stephen curled into bed beside me, his breathing soft and steady. I stared at the ceiling, eyes wide open, replaying every word from that dinner. Every jab. Every dismissive laugh. Every smug glance across the table. I turned my head and looked at him, my husband, the only person in that room who hadn't joined in on the chorus of insults. But he hadn't defended me either. He never did when it came to my family. He said he was trying to keep the peace. I used to think that was kindness. Now, it felt like abandonment. But I wasn't angry at him. Not yet. Not then. My rage was focused. Sharpened. At my mother, who treated me like I was still 12, like I was a disappointment no matter what I achieved. At Michael, who saw me as nothing more than a paper pusher who could maybe answer a few questions about rent. At Hope, who smiled sweetly to my face while making sure I knew I was never quite good enough. But most of all, I was furious with myself. For letting it happen. For shrinking down every time they spoke. For letting them live in my building, at discounted rates, while they spat on everything I built. I didn't explode that night. I could have. I wanted to. But that would have given them the satisfaction. They would have dismissed me as emotional, irrational. Instead, I got up before sunrise. Slipped into my home office while Stephen was still asleep. I opened my laptop. And I started plotting. The thing about building an empire brick by brick is that you know every inch of it. Every weakness. Every loophole. Every clause buried in the fine print. I started with the lease agreements. My fingers hovered over my mother's name first. Then Michael's. Then Hope's. Late payments, small, but recurring. Unauthorized renovations, bathrooms remodeled without permits. Noise complaints. Subletting without notice. Violations. All of them. Things they'd never worried about before because they thought the rules didn't apply to them. Because they thought the property manager, the one they mocked, wasn't anyone who mattered. But I mattered. And I knew the law. I forwarded everything to Maria, my legal assistant. Flag these. Prepare notices of violation. Do not send anything, yet. I'll give the order when it's time. I closed my laptop, but the adrenaline kept me wired. This was just the beginning. For the next week, I was pleasant. Friendly, even. When Mom called with one of her suggestions about how I should consider a more stable career, I listened. I made agreeable sounds. When Hope texted me about a can't-miss opportunity to invest in her latest health supplement scheme, I thanked her for thinking of me and said I'd look into it. When Michael mentioned over drinks that his law firm was always looking for eager women in their real estate division, I smiled and said, "That's so kind of you to offer." But every word, every message, I filed away like ammunition. I started documenting everything, every snide remark, every veiled insult. It wasn't paranoia. It was preparation. I attended building inspections personally. Walked through each hallway. Noted which tenants were content and which had been riled up by Mom's little petition. Elisa, Mom's best friend from the penthouse, greeted me warmly, completely unaware that I held the deed to the floor beneath her feet. She signed Mom's petition. They all did. I smiled through it. Because I knew what was coming. The thing about my mother? She always underestimated me. It was her greatest weakness. She thought I was too soft. Too eager for her approval. She assumed that because I'd never fought back, I never would. But this time was different. This time I wasn't just defending myself. I was reclaiming everything they'd taken from me. Every ounce of confidence they stripped away when they belittled my career. Every achievement they ignored while praising Michael's next promotion. Every dream I downplayed to make them feel comfortable. I wasn't just preparing for a legal battle. I was preparing to take back my dignity. I tightened the policies across all my properties. Sent a memo to the management team. No more leniency. No more friend and family exceptions. Every tenant was to be treated equally, including my family. I authorized late fee enforcement, knowing exactly who those fees would hit hardest. I ordered audits on all unauthorized renovations, starting with my mother's unit. I called my legal team and instructed them to prepare eviction notices, drafted, but not delivered. Not yet. Timing was everything. I wasn't going to strike in anger. That's what they expected. They were waiting for me to blow up, to confirm the story they told themselves, that I was emotional, unstable, not capable of real success. I would not give them that. I would wait. I would smile at Sunday dinner. I would compliment Hope's MLM ventures. I would listen when Michael explained the housing market to me like I was a child. And when they were comfortable, when they thought they had won, I would take everything. Stephen noticed the change. "You've been quiet this week," he said one night as we brushed our teeth. "Just busy," I said. He kissed my temple, satisfied with that answer. I wondered what he would think when the truth came out. When he realized that his wife, the woman he thought was just keeping a little property business afloat, was the owner of half the city skyline. Would he be proud? Or would he feel betrayed, like I had kept part of myself hidden from him? I pushed the thought away. Right now, this wasn't about Stephen. This was about me. I had spent my entire life building something real, something lasting. While they laughed at me over wine glasses, I was crafting a legacy. They didn't respect what I built. So now, they would learn to fear it. The day I pressed send on the notices, I sat in my office, fingers trembling, not with doubt, but with power. This was mine. Every brick, every lease, every signature. They had mocked me because they thought I was weak. Because I let them believe I needed their approval. But they were wrong. I didn't need their acceptance. I needed my power back. And I was taking it. Have you ever had to stay silent while planning your next move? Comment 444 if you know that feeling. I had never walked into my mother's apartment with my head held so high. That Sunday evening, as I smoothed down my blazer instead of my usual modest dress, I felt different. Stronger. Unshakable. The days leading up to this night had been filled with silent preparations, legal documents signed, notices drafted, and every violation neatly organized in a folder tucked under my arm. My empire was ready to reveal itself, and tonight, my family would finally see me for who I was. Stephen was beside me, chatting lightly as we walked down the hall. He didn't know what was about to happen. He sensed something had shifted in me, but he had no idea the magnitude. Part of me felt guilty for not telling him, but a louder part whispered, "He didn't stop them when they humiliated you. He let it happen." I rang the doorbell, and when my mother opened it, her smile was tight, eyes sharp. She loved hosting these dinners, not because she cared about family, but because it was her stage. And I had been her favorite prop for years. "Alexandra, you're early." Trying something new, she teased with that familiar condescension. I smiled, but this time it wasn't forced. It was the smile of a woman who knew she had already won. Everyone was there, Michael swirling his wine, Hope already talking too loudly about her latest business expansion, and Elisa, my mother's friend, perched in the corner like a vulture eager to witness any spectacle. Dinner began as expected, comments about my appearance, questions about whether I was still doing that apartment thing, and of course, praise showered on Stephen for his upcoming promotion. I let it all wash over me like water off a stone. Because tonight, I wasn't there to endure. I was there to end this. Halfway through the meal, my mother tapped her wine glass. My heart quickened, not with fear, but with anticipation. "Everyone," she began, voice dripping with self-importance, "I wanted to follow up on our petition about the building management. I know I've already gathered most of your signatures, but I think we should discuss our next steps. It's time we demand better. We deserve it." Michael chuckled, chiming in, "If they don't listen, I know some good lawyers who could light a fire under them." Hope leaned in, grinning. "I heard the maintenance guy quit. Maybe he got tired of ignoring our complaints." Laughter filled the room. That laughter, the same cruel chorus I had listened to for years. But tonight, it would be their last. I set down my fork gently. "There's no need for the petition." The room quieted. All eyes turned to me. My mother's smile tightened. "Oh, Alexandra, dear, I know you don't understand these things." I interrupted her. Calm. Controlled. I said there's no need. Because I own this building. Silence. Forks clattered against plates. Michael's smirk froze. Hope's wine glass trembled slightly in her hand. My mother blinked as if she hadn't heard me correctly. "You're joking," she said finally, though her voice wavered. I reached into my bag and pulled out the folder, the one containing the property deeds, tax records, and every lease agreement with my signature on it. I placed it in the center of the table, like a royal decree. Audrey, my CFO, entered the room on cue, dressed in sleek professionalism, holding additional documents. Her timing was flawless. "Yes, Yvette," Audrey said, her tone cutting through the tension like a blade. "Your daughter owns this entire block. And more." My mother's face drained of color. Michael leaned forward, snatching the papers, his lawyer's instincts kicking in as he scanned the documents. Hope's jaw hung open, her usual fake confidence shattered. "You raised my rent last year." Hope's voice was high, accusatory. I met her eyes without flinching. "Yes. And I'll raise it again. Unless you start treating me, and my business, with respect." Michael's face turned red. "You've been lying to us." "No," I cut him off. "I've been letting you believe what you wanted. There's a difference." My mother finally found her voice, though it cracked. "This is absurd. Alexandra, you expect us to believe that you—" Audrey stepped in, flipping open another document. "Here's the company registration. AW Properties. Alexander Whitfield. CEO and majority shareholder." Stephen's fork slipped from his hand, clattering onto his plate. He stared at me, eyes wide. "Alex, you own this?" I turned to him, my voice softening for the first time. "Yes. I always have. I built it." The weight of the room shifted. The power dynamics that had ruled my life for so long were dissolving before my eyes. The people who had treated me like a failure were now sitting in a building I controlled, their comfort dependent on my goodwill. My mother's face contorted with disbelief and anger. You've been letting us live here, taking our money. I laughed, but there was no warmth in it. At discounted rates, actually. You've been getting the family deal. You're welcome. Hope's face flushed with humiliation. So, what? You've been laughing at us this whole time? No, Hope, I said, leaning forward. I've been supporting you. Quietly. While you mocked me. Michael shook his head, muttering under his breath, this can't be real. Audrey, ever professional, handed me another folder. The violation notices are ready for delivery. I flipped it open slowly, savoring the moment. Late payments, unauthorized renovations, subletting. You've all broken your leases. My mother's breath hitched. You wouldn't. I met her gaze. Wouldn't I? The silence was heavy. They knew I held all the cards. Every insult, every dismissal, it had all led to this. They were powerless, and for the first time, they knew it. Stephen broke the silence. His voice was careful. Alex, why didn't you tell me? I turned to him, my heart aching, despite the victory. Because every time we sat at this table, I watched you let them humiliate me. I needed something that was mine. Something they couldn't touch. His eyes softened, but I saw the hurt beneath them. That conversation would come later. Tonight was mine. My mother stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. This is betrayal. I stood too, leveling my gaze at her. No, Mother. This is business. Michael exhaled sharply. Hope's eyes welled up, though whether it was from embarrassment or genuine emotion, I couldn't tell. Stephen stared at his plate, processing everything. Audrey stepped back, giving me space. I let the weight of the moment hang in the air. They thought they knew me. They thought I was weak. But tonight, they saw me, truly saw me, for the first time. I suggest you all read your lease agreements carefully, I said calmly. Because from now on, there are no more favors. No more discounts. You will abide by the terms, or you will leave. My mother opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. For once, she was speechless. I turned to Audrey. Let's go. As I walked to the door, Stephen hesitated, torn between his wife and his family. He chose me, this time. He followed. I stepped into the hallway and breathed in deeply. For the first time, I felt free. Behind me, the voices rose, confusion, anger, desperation. But it didn't matter. Because the woman they had underestimated for years had just taken everything back. I had won. Do you think they got what they deserved? Comment 555 if you felt that justice was served. I thought it would feel good. That was the part that surprised me the most. I had spent years picturing that exact moment, my mother's face draining of color, Michael's smugness wiped away, Hope's voice catching in her throat as her mask of superiority cracked. I thought I would walk away from that dinner feeling powerful, triumphant. I thought it would fill the hole they had carved in me with every cruel remark, every dismissal. But standing in my penthouse that night, looking out over the city I had conquered, I felt nothing but the echo of their absence. The silence was suffocating. Stephen had left shortly after we got home. He didn't yell or accuse me of anything. He just sat on the edge of the bed, eyes downcast, and said quietly, I need some time. He packed an overnight bag while I watched from the doorway, my throat too tight to speak. Stephen, He held up his hand. Not now, Alex. I just need to think. Then he was gone. The next day, Hope called me heartless. She left a voicemail so long it cut her off midway. Her voice was shrill, desperate. She said I was cruel, that I had destroyed the family, that I had shattered my mother. She called me a fraud, a liar, a monster. I deleted it halfway through. Michael sent an email, because, of course, he did. Cold, professional, with the subject line, legal inquiry. He threatened to challenge the rent increases and hinted at defamation. His tone was measured, but I knew what it really was: damage control. He was scrambling to maintain the power he had wielded over me for so long. And my mother? She ended up in the hospital the next day. Anxiety attack. Hope texted me a photo: Mom, lying in a hospital bed, looking small and fragile, clutching a rosary she hadn't touched in decades. The caption read, "I hope you're happy." I wasn't. I sat in my office, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the very buildings I had built. My assistant, Maria, dropped off the finalized lease adjustments for my family's units. I skimmed the papers, noting the raised rates, the enforcement clauses. Everything was clean, legal, and ironclad. I had won. But as I held those papers in my hand, I felt hollow. All those years I had told myself that success would heal me. That if I built something big enough, powerful enough, they would have no choice but to respect me. But respect built on fear wasn't respect at all. It was submission. And it felt like ashes in my mouth. That weekend, Stephen came back, not to stay, but to talk. We sat across from each other at our kitchen table, the same table where we used to laugh over takeout and dream about the future. He looked tired. "You lied to me, Alex," he said, his voice steady but heavy. "4 years. Not just about the building, but about who you are." I opened my mouth to defend myself, but he shook his head. "I'm not here to fight. I just need to understand, why?" Tears burned in my eyes, but I forced them down. "Because I didn't think you'd understand. Because I thought you'd see me the way they see me. And because I needed something that was mine." He exhaled slowly, like he was holding back his own tears. "I loved you when we had nothing. I loved you because of you. Not because of what you owned. But you never let me in. You built this whole world, and you locked me out." I looked down at my hands, clasped tightly together. "I didn't mean to lock you out. I was trying to survive." Silence stretched between us. Finally, he stood. "I'm staying at Mark's for a while. I don't know what this means for us yet. But I need space." When the door closed behind him, I felt something break. For the first time in days, I cried. Not out of anger. Not out of defiance. But out of grief. For the marriage I might have shattered. For the family I had lost, flawed as they were. For the girl I used to be, who just wanted to be seen. In the weeks that followed, I buried myself in work. The River Street development was moving forward. Investors were thrilled. My company's name was gaining recognition beyond this city. In the eyes of the world, I was a success story. But every time my phone buzzed, I hoped it was Stephen. Every time I walked past my mother's apartment, now empty, I felt a pang of guilt. Every time I saw Hope's car in the garage, I remembered the venom in her voice. Winning had cost me everything. But in that quiet, something unexpected happened. I began to breathe. For the first time in years, I wasn't measuring my worth against their approval. I wasn't shrinking myself to fit into their version of who I should be. I was standing in my truth, messy and painful as it was. I started running again, something I hadn't done since my 20s, when work consumed me. I read books for pleasure, not just business strategies. I took myself out to dinner, alone, and didn't feel embarrassed. And slowly, I started to realize something. I hadn't built this empire to prove them wrong. I had built it to prove to myself that I was capable. That I was worthy. I was. I always had been. The difference now was that I didn't need them to tell me that anymore. One afternoon, I visited my mother's new apartment, smaller, less glamorous, but still comfortable. She was home, sitting by the window. When she saw me, she tensed, but she didn't tell me to leave. We didn't have a grand reconciliation. There were no tears, no apologies. But we talked, about the weather, about my grandmother, about nothing. It was the first real conversation we'd had in years. When I left, she touched my hand lightly. "You did well, Alexandra. With everything." It wasn't everything I had ever wanted to hear. But it was a start. "Stephen and I are still figuring things out. It's not perfect. It might never be. But we're talking, really talking, about the things we buried under years of pretending everything was fine. I still own the building. I still own the block. But the difference now? I own myself. I am not small. I am not invisible. I am enough." Have you ever had to walk away from someone you love to protect yourself? Comment 666 if you've made that choice. When I started this journey, I thought success meant control. I thought building an empire brick by brick would finally make me feel seen, make me feel valued. I believed that if I could rise above the people who belittled me, I would finally prove I was worth something. But what I've learned is that power without purpose is empty. And proving people wrong is not the same as finding peace. I let my need for validation consume me. I thought taking everything back from those who hurt me would heal the wounds they left behind. But standing in the ruins of my relationships, my marriage strained, my mother in a hospital bed, my sister-in-law calling me heartless, I realized something I never expected. Winning didn't feel like winning at all. The truth is, I wasn't fighting for respect. I was fighting to fill the void left by years of feeling small. Every cruel word, every dismissal, I carried it all like bricks on my back. And when I finally had the chance to throw those bricks at the people who hurt me, I did. But I ended up building a wall around myself instead. That wall kept me in control. But it also kept everyone out. Even the people I loved. Stephen's words cut me the deepest. "You're turning into your mother." For years, I had feared becoming her, someone who wielded power to make others feel small. But when I stood over my mother's hospital bed, seeing her frail and vulnerable for the first time, I realized I was standing on the same path. I had a choice. I could keep raising the rent, filing evictions, and making everyone pay. I could hold on to my power like a weapon. Or, I could build something better. So, I chose to build. I kept my buildings, but I gave my family fair leases, no favors, but no punishment either. I created boundaries instead of walls. I built a community center and named it after my mother, not out of obligation, but because I wanted to create something that lasted. Something that lifted people up instead of tearing them down. And Stephen? We're rebuilding too. Slowly. Honestly. It's not perfect, but we're learning to talk, really talk, about the things we buried for so long. Because the real lesson I learned is this: true power isn't control. True power is knowing your worth, standing tall, and choosing to build a life that reflects your value. It's knowing when to walk away from those who hurt you, but also knowing when to open the door for forgiveness. It's understanding that you don't need to prove anything to anyone. You are enough, right now, as you are. If you've been made to feel small, if you've fought to reclaim your voice, or if you're still finding the strength to walk away from a toxic relationship, know this. Your happiness is not selfish. Your peace is not up for negotiation. And your value is not defined by anyone else's opinion. You deserve a life built on respect, love, and self-worth. And you have the power to build it, brick by brick. Have you ever had to fight to reclaim your power? I want to hear your story. Share it in the comments below. Your voice matters. If this story resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. And if you know someone who needs to hear this message, someone who's struggling to stand up for themselves, share this with them. Let's build each other up, not tear each other down. Because we're all stronger when we choose to build something that lasts.